He came home from the war with nothing but a broken past and a loyal dog. He thought the small town would give him peace, but it gave him a test instead. One moment inside a quiet diner changed everything he believed about silence. They hurt the dog, not knowing what kind of man was standing beside him. He didn't fight back with anger. He chose something far more dangerous, because sometimes God doesn't send miracles from the sky. He sends a choice. Where are you watching from? And if this story touches your heart, please like and subscribe so we can reach 1,000 subs and keep sharing more stories like this. Ethan Cole didn't return to North Haven the way heroes return in old songs, riding in on brass and sunlight, welcomed by banners and names shouted like blessings. He came back the way winter comes, quiet, unavoidable, and already inside your bones before you realize the door was left open. His pickup truck was a dented, stubborn thing, the color of ash after a long fire. It rattled over the red dirt road now buried under a crust of snow, tires crunching through drifts that looked soft until they weren't. The heater wheezed like an old man pretending he wasn't tired. The dashboard clock blinked the wrong time, as if time itself had forgotten this place. Ethan's hands stayed steady on the wheel, large hands, strong but not showy, built for work that didn't leave room for posing. He was about 6 feet tall, lean and compact, the way a blade is lean, the way a tree that has survived 100 storms learns to hold its strength close. His face was clean-shaven, the skin tight over a square jaw and sharp cheekbones, like it had been carved from stubborn granite and then sanded down by cold wind. Dark brown hair, clipped short at the sides, sat a touch longer on top than regulation. Just enough to admit he'd stepped out of uniform, not enough to prove he belonged anywhere else. His skin was fair, but weathered, wind-burned by northern cold. The kind that leaves a faint pink at the edges of the nose and cheeks, no matter how tough you pretend to be. His eyes were the most noticeable thing, gray-blue, the color of winter sky right before snow falls. They didn't linger on anything. They measured, scanned, dismissed, not out of arrogance, out of habit. Years of learning that danger never announces itself with a handshake. Behind him, curled on the back seat, was the only creature in the world Ethan trusted without questions. Coda, a German shepherd, 4 to 5 years old, black and tan with a deep sable shadow along his back that made him look like he'd been dipped in midnight. His chest and legs were warm gold, like late autumn refusing to surrender to winter. He wasn't bulky. He was athletic, all working muscle and quiet readiness. His ears stayed up even when he rested, pivoting at the smallest sound. His amber-brown eyes watched the world with the calm intensity of a sentinel who did not need applause to stay vigilant. Coda's expression was not cute. It was intelligent, thoughtful. Sometimes, when the wind hit a certain way, almost offended, as if the universe had failed to file the proper paperwork before misbehaving. He lifted his head and stared out the window as the first buildings slid into view. North Haven looked like a postcard someone had left out in the rain. The old diner, once a bright place that smelled of syrup and fried potatoes, sat dark, windows boarded. The school building was still there, but the playground swings hung frozen and motionless, like the town had captured laughter and locked it away. A neon sign over the only bar in town flickered weakly, its glow half-hearted, as if it didn't want to admit it was still alive. Snow covered everything in a clean blanket, a liar's blanket, hiding cracks and rotting wood the way polite smiles hide grief. Ethan slowed at the main street. For a moment, he expected something irrational, some part of him still young enough to believe in welcome, to recognize a face, to see a neighbor wave. but the sidewalks were empty. The town stared back without blinking. Koda's body shifted. He sat up straighter. A low sound formed in his throat, not a bark, not a growl meant to scare, but a warning note, soft and controlled. A sound that said, "Something is wrong here. Something is watching." Ethan glanced in the rearview mirror. "What is it, buddy?" he murmured. Koda's gaze didn't move. His ears stayed forward. Ethan felt the old, familiar tightening in his ribs. The sensation of a world holding its breath. He hated it. He'd come here to stop living that way. He'd come here to be ordinary. He'd been out of the Navy only a handful of weeks, but his body still moved like it was answering orders. Boots on, shoulders squared, always alert, always ready, even in a town that looked like it had forgotten how to fight. Ethan told himself Koda was just adjusting. Dogs remembered too. They carried war differently. No speeches, no medals, no explanations, just instincts that never fully switched off. Koda had served. Koda had sniffed out dangers men couldn't see. Koda had learned that silence could hide teeth. And now Koda was telling him North Haven had teeth. Ethan drove past the bar, past the empty diner, past the post office where the flag looked stiff in the wind, as if even patriotism had frozen. He turned onto a narrower road, the one that used to lead home. The trees thickened quickly. Pines stood in tall ranks, heavy with snow. Their branches bent under the weight, creating arched tunnels that made the road feel like a passage into something ancient. The sky was pale and low, the kind of winter sky that made noon look like late afternoon. Ethan's childhood cabin appeared suddenly through the trees. It was smaller than he remembered. Everything from childhood was like that. Huge in memory, modest in truth. The cabin sat half swallowed by the forest, roof sagging slightly, porch railing leaning like a tired man. Snow drifted against the door. The windows were dark, and for a second, Ethan had the absurd thought that the cabin was pretending not to recognize him. He killed the engine. Silence poured in. Not peaceful silence. The kind of silence that felt like an unanswered question. Ethan opened the driver's door and stepped out, boots sinking into snow. The air slapped him immediately. Sharp, clean, and merciless. He breathed it in anyway, as if cold could scrape his lungs clean. Koda jumped down from the truck with a soft thud, landing, steady, head up. He moved in a slow circle around Ethan, checking the perimeter, nose close to the ground. His tail was low but not tucked, alert, not afraid. Ethan watched him and felt something in his chest loosen just slightly. Koda had that effect. Ethan found the spare key where his father had always hidden it, beneath a flat rock at the edge of the porch. The fact that it was still there made him swallow hard. Time had changed everything and nothing at once. He unlocked the door. The cabin smelled like old wood and cold dust and the faint ghost of wood smoke. It was empty of furniture except for what he'd left years ago. A battered table, 2 chairs, a shelf of forgotten jars. The air inside was colder than outside, trapped and stale. Ethan set down his worn duffel. He didn't have much. A few clothes, a few tools, a folded letter he never read because he already knew what it said. His life had been simplified by loss. Koda stepped inside and paused, ears pricked as if listening to the cabin's heartbeat. Ethan tried the heater. It responded with a groan and a cough, then a thin stream of lukewarm air that felt more insulting than helpful. Ethan gave a short laugh, one of those humorless laughs that exists purely to keep a man from shouting. "Well," he said, voice low, "good to see you missed me too." Koda looked up at him, expression solemn, like a judge refusing to be bribed by sarcasm. Ethan rubbed a hand over his face. His palm came away cold. He worked quietly for the next hour, moving like someone who didn't trust stillness. He cleared snow from the porch, stacked a few pieces of firewood, checked the window frames for gaps. The cabin wasn't just a building. It was a test, a small, stubborn trial set by the past. Kota followed, close enough that Ethan could feel him without turning. Sometimes Kota stopped and stared into the trees, head angled, nose twitching, as if the forest whispered in a language Ethan couldn't hear. By the time dusk arrived, Ethan had a small fire going. The flames threw warm light against the walls, making the cabin look less abandoned, more alive. Outside, snow continued to fall in soft sheets, the world blanketing itself in silence. Ethan ate a simple meal. Canned stew warmed over the fire. Kota got kibble mixed with a little water and a small piece of meat Ethan insisted he didn't need. Kota accepted it with dignified reluctance, the way a soldier accepts a promotion he didn't ask for. Ethan sat back against the wall, boots still on. He told himself he would sleep early. His body disagreed, because when the fire crackled low and the cabin settled into night, the memories crept forward like wolves at the edge of a campfire's reach. Not the loud memories, not the ones people imagine. Explosions, gunfire, screams. The quieter ones were worse. A hand slipping from his grasp. A voice over the radio that went abruptly silent. A decision made in seconds that left a permanent scar in the mind. Ethan stared at the flames and felt the old guilt press in, heavy and familiar. He hadn't come to North Haven to be haunted. He'd come because he believed a place that once held his childhood might also hold his peace. Kota, who had been lying near the fire, suddenly lifted his head. His ears snapped forward. His body went rigid. Ethan's muscles tensed before his thoughts caught up. "What?" Ethan whispered. Kota stood, silent as smoke, and walked to the window. He didn't bark. He didn't scratch. He simply stared out into the falling snow. Ethan rose and moved beside him. He pulled the curtain back slightly. Outside, the world was white and gray, moonlight muted by clouds. The trees swayed slowly, heavy with snow. The road beyond the porch was empty, and then Ethan saw it. A shape in the snow. Not a person. Not an animal. A set of footprints, fresh, deep, and deliberate, leading from the road toward the cabin, and then stopping. As if whoever made them had stood there, just beyond the tree line, looking in. Ethan's breath fogged the glass. He leaned closer, trying to see more, but the snowfall thickened like a curtain drawn by invisible hands. Kota let out that low, controlled sound again, a warning that vibrated in his chest. Ethan felt the hair on his arms rise. There was no reason someone should be here. Not tonight. Not in this weather. He hadn't told anyone he was coming. He hadn't spoken to a soul in town. And yet, Kota's gaze never wavered, fixed on the darkness as if it had a face. For one irrational moment, Ethan thought of old stories his mother used to tell. Tales of winter spirits that tested strangers, of unseen judges who watched from the woods to see what kind of man had come back. He didn't believe in ghosts, but he believed in patterns, and he believed in Kota. Ethan stepped away from the window and moved to the door. He didn't open it. He only rested his hand on the handle, feeling the cold metal through his palm. He listened. Nothing. Only wind. Only snow. Kota came to stand at Ethan's side, body angled slightly forward, ready. Ethan forced himself to exhale. "It's nothing," he told Kota, though the words sounded like a prayer more than a statement. Probably just a drifter, or someone lost. Kota did not relax, and Ethan, despite his own denial, didn't either. He latched the door, checked the window locks, stoked the fire higher. Then he sat on the floor beside Coda and rested his hand on the dog's thick fur. Warm, real, present. Coda leaned into the touch, not demanding comfort, simply offering companionship as if it were a sacred duty. Outside, the wind rose and rattled the cabin boards like bones. Snow kept falling, covering footprints, erasing evidence, pretending innocence. But the feeling remained, an unseen pressure in the air, a shift in the world. Ethan stared into the flames until his eyes burned. He had returned to a town that didn't remember him, or worse, a town that remembered exactly the wrong things. Coda, still watching the window, refused to sleep. And for the first time since he'd left the teams, Ethan understood something with sharp clarity. He hadn't escaped the battlefield. He'd only changed the terrain. Morning in North Haven arrived like a polite stranger, quiet, pale, and unwilling to make promises. Ethan woke before the sun fully lifted its head above the pines. The cabin was cold enough to make his breath visible, the kind of cold that didn't shock you so much as remind you, gently and repeatedly, that comfort was a luxury. The fire from last night had collapsed into gray ash. The walls creaked as the wind pressed against them, testing for weakness. Coda rose the moment Ethan shifted. The German shepherd's coat, black across his back, tan along his chest and legs, caught the faint light and turned it into a subdued sheen, like old leather well cared for. He stretched, long and controlled, then stood with that familiar readiness. Ears up, eyes steady, body angled as if the world might need negotiating at any second. Ethan pulled on the same worn outfit he'd worn yesterday, the olive-gray tactical combat shirt softened by years of use, the earth-toned combat pants with faded knees, the old work boots that looked like they'd walked through more seasons than most men had lived. A scuffed military watch sat on his wrist, face scratched, ticking faithfully like it had never heard the word discharge. He stepped outside. The forest greeted him with snow and silence. Sunlight filtered through pine branches, turning falling flakes into drifting sparks. The air smelled clean, sharp resin, cold earth, and the faint metallic taste of winter. For a moment, Ethan stood still, letting the cold bite into his cheeks. He told himself this was why he'd come back. Not for company, not for closure. For this, space, quiet, a world that didn't ask him to perform. Coda sniffed the porch steps, then moved into the yard, nose low. His tail remained level and calm, not wagging, not stiff. He was working, reading the ground the way Ethan read doorways. Ethan shoveled a narrow path from the porch to the truck. Snow slid off the blade in soft heaps. The motion was simple and honest. It felt good, until the ache in his shoulder reminded him that simplicity never erased history. It only distracted it. By the time he finished, his hands were numb through his gloves. He climbed into the truck with Coda jumping lightly into the back seat and pointed the pickup toward town. North Haven looked different in daylight, and not in a flattering way. Night had hidden the town's tiredness behind shadows. Morning revealed it. Cracked sidewalks patched too many times, paint peeling from storefronts, a few crooked for sale signs half buried in snow like tombstones for abandoned dreams. A Christmas wreath still hung on the post office door, brown and brittle, as if the town had tried to celebrate and then forgotten how. Ethan parked near the general store, one of the few places that appeared open. The bell above the door rang when he entered, a thin, cheerful sound that didn't match the room. Warm air rolled over him, smelling of coffee, old wood, and cinnamon that had long ago given up on being fresh. Behind the counter stood a woman Ethan didn't recognize at first, until she turned and time folded in on itself. Mary Collins had aged the way some trees age, slowly, stubbornly, with beauty in the endurance. She was in her early 60s, short and sturdy with a posture that refused to collapse. Her hair was iron gray and pulled into a practical bun at the base of her neck. Fine lines mapped her face, especially around her eyes. But those eyes were bright. Hazel with the sharpness of someone who had watched the same town repeat the same mistakes for decades. She stared at Ethan for half a beat, and then her expression softened. Not into a smile exactly, but into recognition. "Lord have mercy," she said, voice roughened by years of cold mornings and unsaid opinions. "You've got your father's shoulders." Ethan's throat tightened. "Mary," he managed, like the name was a piece of glass he didn't want to swallow. Mary came around the counter and stopped a respectful distance away, as if she sensed he'd come back carrying something fragile that didn't like to be touched. "You grew up," she said, eyes traveling over him. His clean-shaven jaw, the military cut of his hair, the way he stood like walls might move. "And you came home." Ethan gave a small nod. "For a while?" Mary's gaze flicked to Coda, who stood just inside the doorway, calm but alert. The dog's eyes tracked the room like he was counting exits and measuring the space between strangers. "That's a serious-looking boy," Mary said. Coda blinked slowly, as if acknowledging a compliment he didn't need. "He's Coda," Ethan said. "He's with me." Mary's face softened again. "Good," she murmured, like it was a blessing. Ethan grabbed a few basics: coffee, canned food, dog kibble, bandages. When he brought them to the counter, Mary rang them up without asking, questions he wasn't ready to answer. But silence in small towns is never empty. It's a room full of things no one wants to say out loud. Mary leaned in slightly, lowering her voice as if winter itself might overhear. "You picked a hard season to return," she said. Ethan shrugged. "Seemed fitting." Mary studied him. "North Haven isn't what you left." "I noticed." Her eyes shifted toward the front window. Outside, a black SUV rolled slowly down the main road, tires cutting clean lines into the snow. It didn't stop. It didn't need to. Mary's mouth tightened. "You'll hear a name," she said, "and you'll want to pretend it doesn't matter. Don't do that." Ethan followed her gaze. "Whose name?" Mary hesitated just long enough for Ethan to feel the weight of it. "Hargreaves," she said. Blake Hargreaves, specifically. The name meant nothing to Ethan, but Mary spoke it like it was a storm. "He owns the mill," she continued. "Owns the gas station. Owns half the jobs people still have. His family's money kept this town standing when the mines shut down, and now he walks around like he built the mountains himself." Ethan's jaw tightened. "Sounds like a businessman." Mary's laugh was short and humorless. "Sure, if you call a wolf a businessman because he learned to wear boots." Ethan paid and nodded once, the gesture of a man filing away information. As he turned to leave, the bell above the door rang again. Two men entered, brushing snow from their shoulders. They were strangers to Ethan, but their faces carried the familiar shape of small-town cruelty. Bored eyes, quick smirks, the swagger of men who'd never been forced to examine themselves in honest light. One was tall and stringy, with a patchy beard that looked like it didn't know whether it wanted to exist. The other was broader, thick-necked, his hair buzzed short, and his cheeks flushed red from cold or alcohol, hard to tell. Both wore expensive winter jackets that looked too clean for the work this town required. Coda's ears pricked, not aggressive, just attentive. The broader man noticed the dog and made a face like he'd tasted something unpleasant. "Big mutt," he muttered, loud enough to be heard. Mary's posture stiffened behind the counter. Ethan didn't react. not outwardly. He stepped aside slightly to give them room. The tall one's eyes flicked to Ethan's watch, then to Ethan's boots, then to the faint outline of old scars along Ethan's knuckles, details most people didn't notice. The tall man smirked. "You new in town?" he asked, though his tone suggested the opposite. "You don't belong here." Ethan met his gaze, calm. Gray-blue eyes like winter steel. "Just passing through," the broad man snorted. "Nobody passes through North Haven. Not anymore." Ethan's expression didn't change. "Then I'm an exception." Coda shifted, his weight. One controlled step closer to Ethan, placing himself slightly between Ethan and the men, not threatening, simply present. The kind of presence that made fools consider their choices, if they were capable of considering anything at all. The broad man clicked his tongue at Coda. "Back up, dog." Coda didn't move. Mary's voice cut in, firm as a chopping block. "Leave it," she said, eyes sharp. "This is my store." The men held Mary's gaze for a second, long enough to show they weren't used to being challenged, then laughed as if resistance was a joke they could afford. They moved past Ethan toward the shelves, still chuckling. Ethan left without another word. Outside, the cold hit him like truth. He loaded the supplies into the truck. Coda jumped into the back seat and sat upright, watching the store door until Ethan climbed in. Ethan drove toward the edge of town, toward the gas station for a fill-up before heading back to the cabin. The station was a squat building with a single pump island and a faded sign. A man stood outside near the office door, smoking despite the cold. He looked like he'd been carved from the same stone as the mountains. Broad shoulders, weathered face, and a thick mustache dusted with snow. His uniform jacket was old and worn at the elbows. A badge caught the light. Daniel Frost, the police chief, though Ethan didn't know his name yet. Frost's eyes were steady and tired, the eyes of a man who had spent too long standing between trouble and a town that didn't want to see itself honestly. His hair was mostly gray, cut short, and his hands, when he flicked ash from his cigarette, looked like they'd once been strong enough to lift engines. He watched Ethan's truck roll in and didn't move to greet him right away. He waited, letting Ethan step out first, letting him reveal whether he was prey or problem. Ethan approached the pump. Frost's gaze flicked to Coda, then to Ethan's military watch, then to Ethan's stance. "You're not local," Frost said at last. Ethan didn't answer with a story. He answered with the truth. "I used to be." Frost's mustache twitched. Not quite a smile, not quite disapproval. "Name?" "Ethan Cole." Frost's expression shifted. Not surprise. Recognition. A memory pulled from a drawer. "Cole," Frost repeated. "You're Dean Cole's boy." Ethan's throat tightened again. He nodded once. Frost took another drag of his cigarette and exhaled slowly. "Town's changed." "So I'm hearing." Frost's eyes hardened slightly, not at Ethan, but at something behind him. "If you're smart, you'll keep your head down." Ethan's mouth turned faintly, humor without joy. "I came here for quiet." Frost glanced toward the main road, where the black SUV from earlier passed again, slow and deliberate, like it wanted to be seen. Frost lowered his voice. "Quiet costs extra, now," he said. "And there's a man who collects." Ethan followed Frost's glance. "Hargreaves?" Frost didn't deny it. "Blake," he said, as if the first name tasted bitter. "He's got money and friends in the wrong places. People here don't love him, but they depend on him." Ethan's jaw tightened. Dependence isn't loyalty. Frost looked at him for a long moment, measuring the type of man standing in front of him, measuring whether Ethan was the kind who would learn or the kind who would refuse. Finally, Frost said, quieter, It doesn't have to be loyalty for it to ruin you. Ethan's hand stayed steady on the pump handle, but something inside him shifted. A subtle adjustment. Like a compass needle moving toward north, whether you like it or not. Coda let out a low huff from the back seat, eyes fixed on the black SUV disappearing into the snowfall. Ethan glanced at him. "You don't like that car," he murmured. Coda blinked once, slow and deliberate, and turned his head slightly toward Frost, then back to the road. Frost noticed. His eyes narrowed. "Your dog trained?" Ethan nodded. "Used to be." Frost's gaze sharpened at the wording. "Used to be what?" Ethan didn't answer. Not because he was hiding. Because some truths were heavy, and he'd only just returned to a town that felt like it was made of fragile glass. Frost didn't push. He flicked his cigarette into the snow and crushed it with his boot. Before Ethan could climb back into the truck, Frost said, "If you hear people go quiet when you walk in a room, don't take it personal." Ethan paused. "Then what should I take it as?" Frost's voice was low, steady. "A warning or a prayer. Depends on the day." Ethan nodded once, climbed into the truck, and pulled away. As he drove back toward the cabin, snow thickened again, falling in steady curtains. The road narrowed into forest, and the world outside the windshield became a tunnel of white and green. Coda sat upright beside him, calm but watchful. Ethan's mind replayed Mary's words, Frost's tone, the way those men in the store had looked at him, not with curiosity, but with ownership. He'd come back expecting emptiness. Instead, he'd found something worse, a town full of people holding their breath. Halfway up the forest road, Coda suddenly rose from the seat and pressed his nose toward the cracked passenger window, nostrils flaring. He didn't bark. He didn't whine. He froze, like a statue carved from instinct. Ethan's grip tightened on the wheel. "Coda?" The dog's ears tilted forward, and a low sound vibrated in his chest, not fear, recognition. Ethan slowed. There, half buried in the snow at the edge of the road, was a child's mitten. Small, red, and soaked through, as if it had been dropped in a hurry. Next to it, faint in the drifted powder, were marks. Not quite footprints, not quite drag, lines. More like someone had stumbled, then been pulled, then the snow had tried to forgive it. Ethan's heart thudded once. Hard. He stopped the truck. Coda stared at the mitten as if it were speaking. Ethan opened the door, cold air knifing in. He stepped out, boots sinking, and picked up the mitten. It was stiff with ice, the kind a kid wore to school. There was no blood, no obvious sign of injury, but the forest suddenly felt less like peace and more like a witness. Ethan looked down the road in both directions. Only snow and trees. Coda sniffed the air, slow, methodical, then turned his head toward the deeper woods, tail low, body tense. Ethan swallowed. He'd returned to North Haven for quiet, but the world had placed a small red mitten in his path like an unanswered question, and Coda, faithful as fate, was waiting to see what kind of man would respond. Ethan closed his fingers around the mitten and climbed back into the truck, eyes fixed ahead, jaw set, not chasing trouble, just refusing to ignore what the snow had tried to hide. Back at the cabin, Ethan carried the supplies inside and set the mitten on the table, away from the fire, as if respecting it. Coda paced once, then lay near the door, ears still angled toward the trees. Ethan sat on the edge of the chair, elbows on his knees, staring at that small red thing like it was a prophecy. He didn't know whose child it belonged to. He didn't know what had happened on that road. But he knew what it felt like when a place begged for help without saying the words. Outside, the wind rose again. And somewhere out there, beyond the pines, beyond the snow. North Haven kept its secrets like frost on glass. Ethan exhaled slowly and reached down to rest his hand on Coda's neck. "Okay," he whispered. Not to the dog alone, but to whatever unseen thread had tied him back to this town. "I'm listening." The afternoon arrived wearing false gentleness. Snow fell in wide, quiet flakes, soft as feathers, disguising the edges of everything sharp. The sky was a pale sheet stretched tight over the mountains, and the town looked almost beautiful, like a child's drawing done in whites and grays, with neat rooftops and peaceful streets. Ethan knew better. He'd learned, in places far from North Haven, that danger often showed up dressed like calm. He drove into town with Coda riding upright in the passenger seat this time, as if the dog had decided the front was where a sentinel belonged. Coda's black and tan coat was brushed clean, his posture proud and composed, though his eyes never stopped working, tracking movement, reading silhouettes, listening for footsteps that didn't match the rhythm of the street. Ethan parked near the small cafe on Main, the only place Mary had said still made decent coffee. The building itself was narrow and old, its sign faded but stubborn, painted letters that had once been cheerful. Warm yellow light glowed behind fogged windows, and for a moment, Ethan felt something almost like hope. Inside, the air smelled of roasted beans, sugar, and wet wool coats drying too slowly. A small bell chimed above the door, the same kind of bell that tried to sound welcoming even when the world refused. Ethan stepped in, boots leaving shallow prints of slush on the worn wooden floor. Coda followed at heel, close enough that Ethan could feel his presence like an extra heartbeat. Behind the counter stood a woman who looked like she'd been built by winter but softened by time. Her name was Lena Hart, though Ethan didn't know that yet. Lena was in her mid-30s, tall and slender, with a posture that stayed straight not out of pride, but practice, like someone who'd learned that showing weakness in a place like this could be expensive. Her hair was a dark auburn, pulled back into a loose braid that brushed the collar of her sweater. Her skin was pale with a dusting of freckles across the bridge of her nose, and her hands, when she reached for a mug, were quick and capable, the hands of someone who worked too much and slept too little. A faint scar ran along one knuckle, healed but noticeable, like a punctuation mark left by a hard year. Her eyes were the color of black tea, dark, steady, and hard to fool. She noticed Ethan the way someone notices weather changing, not with surprise but with instinct. "Coffee?" she asked, voice low and even. Ethan nodded. "Just black." Lena's gaze dipped briefly to Coda, then back to Ethan. "He's trained," she said, not a question. Ethan didn't smile, but his eyes softened a fraction. He was. Lena's mouth tightened in something close to understanding. She poured the coffee and slid it across the counter. No chatter, no nosy questions, a kindness with boundaries. Ethan took a seat near the window where he could see the street. Habit, simple geometry of survival. Coda lay down beside the chair, front paws crossed, head up, watching the room the way a lighthouse watches the sea. A few locals sat scattered around, an elderly man nursing a cup with trembling hands, a young mother rocking a baby, two teenagers hunched over their phones like prayer books. People glanced at Ethan and looked away quickly, not rudely, but carefully, like he was a flame, and they weren't sure whether it was safe to stand close. Ethan sipped his coffee and pretended he didn't notice. He was almost through the cup when the cafe door opened again, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop. Not from cold air, from attention. A man stepped in with the confidence of someone who believed the town belonged to him, the way a landlord believes a building belongs to him, even the rooms he never enters. Blake Hargreaves. He was younger than Ethan had expected. Early 30s, fit but not athletic, built more from privilege than labor. He wore an expensive winter coat that looked too clean for the season, dark and tailored, with a collar that framed his face like a costume. His hair was light brown, styled carefully, the kind of hair that had never been cut by a friend in a bathroom mirror. A faint stubble shadowed his jaw, deliberately maintained, making him look rugged without requiring him to do anything rugged at all. Blake's smile was sharp and practiced, pleasant enough to pass in public, but with an edge that promised humiliation for anyone who didn't cooperate. Two men followed him in, one tall and stringy, the other thick-necked, familiar faces from Mary's store. They moved like satellites around a planet, pulled by Blake's gravity, laughing at nothing, as if laughter itself was their job. Lena's hands slowed behind the counter, her eyes lowered. Not fear exactly, more like habit. Blake scanned the cafe, and his gaze landed on Ethan. Blake's eyebrows lifted, amused. "Oh, well," he said, voice smooth as expensive whiskey. "We've got a visitor." Ethan didn't react outwardly. He took another sip of coffee, calm and controlled. His gray-blue eyes flicked up, met Blake's, and held for a quiet beat. Coda's ears tilted forward. Blake noticed the dog and let out a soft, mocking laugh. "That your security system?" One of his men snickered. Ethan's voice was level. "He's my dog." Blake stepped closer, hands in his pockets, boots leaving no snow because his friends had likely brushed them off for him. He leaned slightly, as if intimacy gave him power. "This town doesn't get many newcomers," Blake said. "And the ones who show up usually don't bring that." He nodded toward Coda like the dog was something unpleasant on a shoe. Coda didn't growl yet. He simply rose, calm and deliberate, and placed himself between Ethan and Blake, body angled protectively. His tail remained steady, low but not tucked. His eyes were fixed, intelligent, unblinking. Blake's smile widened. "Oh, he thinks he's brave." Ethan felt something tighten in his chest. Not anger, something colder. A warning flare, quiet but bright. "Back off," Ethan said. 2 simple words. No threat, just fact. Blake's eyes flashed. Surprise first, then delight, like a bully finding a toy that squeaks. "And who's going to make me?" Blake asked softly. "You or the dog?" The cafe fell silent in that particular way small towns go quiet. Like everyone is holding their breath and hoping someone else will be the first to exhale. Lena didn't move, but her fingers clenched around a cloth behind the counter. Ethan stayed seated, shoulders relaxed, posture unhurried. That calm was what irritated Blake most. Men like Blake depended on reaction. Calm made them feel invisible. Blake leaned slightly to the side, trying to see around Coda to Ethan. "You don't know where you are," he said, tone, sugar-coated. "North Haven isn't forgiving." Ethan's eyes remained steady. "Neither am I." A few people in the cafe shifted uncomfortably, as if the words had cracked something fragile. Blake laughed, sharp and mean. "Look at you," he said, "acting like you're someone." Ethan's fingers curled once around the mug, then relaxed. He could feel his pulse in his wrists, a drumbeat he knew too well. His body remembered 1,000 ways to end this. His mind remembered why he had promised he wouldn't. Blake's gaze slid down to Coda's collar. Military grade. Durable. Worn. Blake's expression hardened. "Get that animal out of my way." Coda didn't move. One of Blake's men, the thick-necked one, took a step forward, but Blake lifted a hand, stopping him. "No," Blake said. "I've got it." He stepped closer, and the room seemed to shrink around him, as if his ego required space. Koda's lips pulled back slightly. Not a snarl, just a warning. Blake's boot moved fast. A sharp kick, aimed at Koda's hind leg. The sound wasn't loud. It was worse than loud. It was the sickening thud of leather meeting bone through muscle and fur. Koda slid on the icy slush near the door, nails scraping for traction. He let out a low, pained sound. Half yelp, half gasp, then forced himself upright, trembling but refusing to flee. His eyes stayed on Ethan, not accusing, apologetic, like he was sorry to be hurt. Ethan felt the world narrow. His hands clenched so tightly, the tendons in his forearms stood out like cords. He could hear his own breathing, slow and controlled, like he was back in training, like someone had just given him an order. Every instinct in him screamed, "End it!" But he didn't move toward Blake. He moved toward Koda. Ethan knelt beside the dog, one hand steadying Koda's chest, the other carefully checking the leg. Koda flinched, but didn't pull away. "It's okay," Ethan murmured, voice low and even. "I've got you." Blake laughed, savoring the humiliation. "Aw," he said. "Look at that. The tough guy and his dog." Ethan's jaw tightened. He lifted Koda's paw gently and found what he feared, swelling already rising, the joint stiffening. Ethan stood slowly, his expression unreadable. He didn't look at Blake with rage. He looked at him like a man marking coordinates. Ethan reached into his pocket, pulled out cash, and placed it on the table, enough to cover the coffee and more. A quiet, respectful act in a room that had forgotten respect. He turned to Lena. "Sorry," he said softly. Lena's eyes were shiny, but her voice didn't break. "Don't be," she whispered. Ethan bent and lifted Koda with careful strength. The dog was heavy and warm, breath coming shallow from pain and pride. Koda's head rested briefly against Ethan's shoulder, trusting him completely. Ethan carried Koda out into the snow. Outside, the cold hit them like a slap. The world had gone gray-white, flakes falling thicker now, wind pushing them sideways. The street was empty. Everyone suddenly had somewhere else to be. Blake followed them out just far enough to make sure Ethan heard him. "In this town," Blake called, voice smooth and confident. "You don't get to ignore me." Ethan paused at the truck, opening the door carefully to slide Koda into the back seat. He tucked a blanket around the dog, then shut the door gently. Only then did Ethan look back. His face was calm, too calm. "I'm not ignoring you," Ethan said. Blake smirked. "Good." Ethan continued, voice quiet as falling snow. "I'm choosing what kind of man I'm going to be." For a moment, Blake's smile faltered. Just a flicker of confusion, like he couldn't understand someone refusing to play the game. Then he recovered, scoffing. "Whatever helps you sleep." Ethan climbed into the truck and drove away. The road back to the cabin felt longer than it had that morning. Snow thickened, covering tire tracks almost as soon as they were made, as if the world was trying to erase evidence. Koda lay curled on the seat, breathing slow, eyes half closed. His ears twitched with each bump of the road, but he didn't whine. He bore pain the way he bore everything, with quiet discipline. Ethan's hands were steady on the wheel. Inside, though, something was shifting, not into anger, into resolve. He'd come back to disappear. But Blake had left a mark. On Koda's leg, yes, and on Ethan's conscience. Back at the cabin, Ethan carried Koda inside and laid him near the fire. He warmed water, cleaned the paw, wrapped the swelling carefully with the precision of a man who had once bandaged teammates under worse conditions. Koda watched Ethan's face the entire time, eyes soft, trusting, unaware that his pain was turning into a line in the sand. Ethan sat on the floor beside him after the bandage was secured, one hand resting on Koda's neck, feeling the steady beat of life under his palm. Outside, snow fell harder, tapping at the windows like impatient fingers. Ethan stared into the fire. He thought of all the times he'd walked away from fights, all the times restraint had saved someone, all the times it had cost someone. His throat tightened, not with fear, but with the weight of choice. He leaned his forehead gently against Koda's head. "I'm sorry," he whispered, not because he hadn't fought, but because he had believed silence could protect them. Koda's tail thumped once, slow and forgiving. Ethan looked up at the cabin wall, at the shadows thrown by the fire, and felt the truth settle in his chest like a stone. In a town ruled by fear, silence wasn't neutrality. It was permission. And Ethan Cole, freshly returned, freshly broken, still trying to be a good man, finally understood. Quiet had brought him home, but quiet would not keep him safe. Koda, half asleep near the fire, suddenly lifted his head. Not from pain, from something else. His ears snapped toward the front door. His nose flared once, sharp and focused. Then he crawled forward, slowly, limping, until he reached Ethan's boots. Koda pressed his muzzle against Ethan's pant leg and held it there, as if anchoring him. Ethan frowned. "What is it, boy?" Koda didn't growl, didn't bark. He simply stared at Ethan with a look that was almost human, steady, urgent, pleading. And in that stare, Ethan felt something he hadn't felt since the day he left the teams. A command without words. Not to attack, not to run, just to wake up. Ethan swallowed hard, hand tightening on Koda's fur. Outside, the wind howled. Inside, Ethan realized the dog wasn't asking for revenge. He was asking for courage. The days after the cafe incident moved with the slow cruelty of winter. Snow kept falling as if it had a job to do, covering the town, whitening the roofs, smoothing the ruts in the road until everything looked clean from a distance. Up close, the cracks still showed. The rot still breathed. Inside the cabin, the fire burned low and steady, but Ethan felt no warmth in it. He sat with Koda's injured leg cradled carefully in his hands, checking the swelling each morning the way he used to check a teammate's bandage. Quiet, methodical, refusing panic, because panic never helped anyone heal. Koda bore the pain with the discipline of an old soldier. He limped, yes. He moved slower, yes. But his eyes stayed bright and focused, and his ears still caught every shift in the wind. Sometimes he stared at Ethan with that same solemn look, as if reminding him, "We survived worse. We can survive this." Ethan wasn't sure he believed it, because pain in a dog was simple, bone and tendon, and bruised muscle. Pain in a man was trickier. It lived in memory. It hid behind choices. On the third day, Ethan tried to keep life small. He chopped wood, fixed a loose porch board, hammered nails into rotting planks. He didn't go into town. He didn't want to see Blake's smirk in his mind again. He didn't want to feel the way the cafe had gone silent like a church before a funeral. But Koda didn't let the world stay small. That afternoon, while the light was still pale and the snow fell like slow confetti, Koda rose from his blanket near the fire and walked to the door. He stood there, waiting. Ethan looked up. "No," he said immediately, like a man refusing temptation. Koda didn't whine. He didn't paw at the door. He simply turned his head and stared at Ethan, ears forward, eyes steady, the same patient insistence he'd used in the field when he caught a scent that mattered. Ethan exhaled through his nose, half amused, half irritated. "You're stubborn," he muttered. Coda blinked once, calm, unoffended, as if to say, "Yes, that's the point." Ethan grabbed a leash, not because Coda needed it, but because rules made Ethan feel like he still had control over something. He wrapped a scarf around his neck, pulled on gloves, and stepped outside. The cold hit him like a slap from an old friend. Coda limped down the porch steps and then stubbornly picked up his pace. Not fast, not reckless, but determined. He tugged Ethan toward the road that ran past the cabin and deeper into the woods, away from town. "Where are we going?" Ethan asked, though he already felt the answer in the tension of Coda's body. Coda didn't look back. He led. They walked for nearly 20 minutes. The snow muffled sound. The forest stood tall and patient, pines heavy with white burdens. Ethan's boots crunched quietly, and the only other noise was Coda's breathing, steady and measured, and the faint jingle of his collar tag. Then the trees thinned, and the world opened. Ahead lay a frozen lake, flat, pale, and vast, its surface covered in wind-swept snow like a sheet pulled tight. At the far end of the shoreline, half hidden behind a ridge and a cluster of dead brush, stood an old warehouse. It looked abandoned the way a skeleton looks abandoned, still standing, but emptied of purpose. The building was long and low, metal siding rusted, windows broken and patched with plywood. The roof sagged in places like it had been punched by time. A chain-link fence leaned around it, partially collapsed, as if it had given up on pretending it could keep anyone out. Ethan stopped. Coda kept going. Ethan's stomach tightened. "Coda," he warned. Coda didn't lunge toward the warehouse. He moved carefully, nose low, circling the edge of the fence line as if mapping the place. His injured leg slowed him, but he didn't quit. His body posture was alert, tail low, ears forward, like a soldier approaching a suspicious door. Ethan followed, heartbeat quiet but insistent. He didn't know why the warehouse existed out here. He didn't remember it from childhood. Or maybe he did and had filed it away as irrelevant, the way kids file away adult problems. Coda stopped near a gap in the fence and sniffed deeply. His entire body stiffened. Ethan saw it immediately. Coda's nostrils flared, his head lifted, and his focus narrowed into something sharp. Not fear, recognition. Ethan's breath fogged as he whispered, "What do you smell?" Coda's ears flicked once, and he let out a low, controlled sound, barely a growl, more like a warning vibration in his chest. Ethan's skin prickled. In the military, Coda had been trained to detect more than 1,000 variations of danger. Explosives, fuel, chemical traces that human noses couldn't interpret. Ethan hadn't wanted to think about that part of Coda's past anymore. He'd wanted Coda to just be a dog. But Coda was doing his job again. Ethan crouched and scanned the snow near the fence gap. Tire tracks. Fresh. Too wide for standard sedans. Heavy tread. He stood and looked toward the warehouse. A faint humming drifted through the air, like a generator running. That didn't belong in an abandoned place. Ethan's mouth went dry. He stepped closer, careful, keeping the trees between himself and the building. Coda moved with him, quieter now, his limp almost gone in the focus of adrenaline. Through a broken window, Ethan saw light. Not the warm light of a fire. Harsh, artificial, bright. He watched long enough to see movement, shadows passing behind stacked pallets. And then he heard voices, men's voices, low and laughing. Ethan backed away slowly. He didn't need to see faces to understand what he was looking at. The warehouse wasn't abandoned. It was being used. Coda pressed his nose toward the air again, then suddenly froze. His head snapped to the left, toward a side entrance, where a metal door hung half ajar. Ethan followed the line of Coda's gaze and saw something that made his chest go cold. A red and white warning placard on a cylinder near the doorway. Propane. More cylinders sat stacked beside it, half buried in snow, as if they'd been dragged out here in a hurry. Ethan swallowed. Propane and generators and illegal operations in a decrepit warehouse meant one thing: fire waiting for a match. He turned to pull back, to leave quietly, to take this to Frost, or someone who still believed in law. But then Coda stiffened again, harder this time. His eyes widened, his nostrils flared so sharply Ethan could almost hear the inhale. Coda's body trembled, not from pain, from urgency. Ethan recognized it instantly from the field. The dog had detected something dangerous, something immediate. Coda gave one sharp huff, not a bark, just a forceful breath. Then he backed up, pulling Ethan with him, insisting without words, "Move. Now." Ethan's heart punched against his ribs. He didn't argue. He grabbed Coda and pulled him back toward the tree line. Snow kicked up under Ethan's boots. Coda limped but didn't slow, fueled by the kind of instinct that saved lives. They were halfway down the ridge when it happened. A sound like the world cracking. A muffled boom echoed across the frozen lake, and a pulse of heat rolled through the air, followed by a sudden plume of gray smoke rising from the warehouse roof. The building didn't explode into a fireball, not yet, but something inside had ignited. Metal groaned. Snow slid off the roof in a rushing sheet. Ethan hit the ground hard, pulling Coda down with him behind a fallen log. His ears rang. The smell hit seconds later. Burnt fuel, propane, scorched wood. Coda lay pressed against Ethan's chest, trembling, eyes wide but alive. Ethan stared at the smoke rising into the winter sky, and for the first time since he'd returned, he felt fear. Not for himself, but for how close he'd come. If Coda hadn't pulled him back. Ethan swallowed hard, throat tight. He pressed his forehead to Coda's head, his gloved hand gripping the dog's thick fur. "Good boy," he whispered, voice rough. "You saved me." Coda licked Ethan's chin once, brief, almost embarrassed, as if affection was unnecessary. Then his eyes returned to the warehouse. The smoke thinned slightly, and through it, Ethan saw something that made his stomach twist. Men were running out of the building now, stumbling into the snow, shouting, coughing. One of them slipped, caught himself, and turned to scream something back inside. Even from this distance, Ethan could hear the panic in it. This wasn't just a hidden work site. It was a ticking bomb. Ethan stayed still, watching, mind racing. He couldn't charge in, not alone, not without gear, not with Coda injured. But he also couldn't pretend he hadn't seen this. The warehouse sat near the lake, tucked away from town like a sin hidden behind scripture. Whoever ran it didn't want eyes, and Ethan had just become eyes. He led Coda back to the cabin the long way, staying in the trees, avoiding roads. Snow continued to fall, as if trying to erase the smoke and the evidence. But Ethan couldn't unsee the generator light, the propane, the shadows inside. Back home, he checked Coda's leg again. The limp was worse now. Adrenaline had carried Coda, but pain reclaimed him once he rested. Ethan's jaw clenched with guilt. He'd taken Coda out when the dog needed rest. And yet, if he hadn't, Ethan might be dead. He sat at the kitchen table, hands wrapped around a mug of cold coffee, staring at the wall while Coda lay near the fire. Coda's ears still flicked at every sound outside, but his breathing had settled. Ethan's mind returned to Mary's warning, Frost's tired eyes, Blake's smug smile, and now this, a hidden warehouse, propane, generator, men, moving pallets like they were unloading secrets. A blast that didn't look like an accident so much as negligence wearing a mask. Ethan could feel the shape of it forming. The town's fear wasn't just about bullying. It was about what money protected. He looked at Coda, the dog's amber eyes watching him with quiet certainty. Coda wasn't just protecting him. Coda was pointing, as if some unseen hand had tugged the leash of fate and said, "Not here to hide, Ethan. Here to see." Ethan stood and walked to the window. Snow drifted through the trees in gentle curtains. The world looked innocent. He knew it wasn't. He rested a hand on the glass and exhaled. "Okay," he murmured, not sure if he was speaking to Coda, to God, or to the ghosts inside his own ribs. "You got my attention." Coda's tail thumped once against the floor, slow, deliberate, like a gavel coming down. Ethan turned from the window, and in the center of his chest, where numbness had lived for years, something stirred. Not rage, purpose. And purpose, Ethan knew, was more dangerous than anger, because it didn't burn out, it built. As Ethan knelt to adjust Coda's bandage, the dog suddenly lifted his head and stared at the cabin door. Not toward the window, not toward the forest. Straight at the door, eyes wide, ears angled forward, breath held. Then Coda whined once, softly, an unfamiliar sound from a dog who rarely complained. Ethan froze. Coda stood, limping, and walked to the door. Then stopped, as if waiting for Ethan to notice something he couldn't yet name. Ethan rose slowly, heart tightening. He hadn't heard footsteps, hadn't heard a car. But Coda was certain. Ethan reached for the door latch, pausing with his fingers on cold metal, listening. Nothing. And yet Coda's gaze didn't waver. Ethan swallowed, and in that silence, he felt it. The same pressure he'd felt in war zones right before contact. Whatever was outside, it wasn't just the forest. And Coda had sensed it first. The storm arrived like an accusation. It didn't drift in gently the way snow had for days. It came with teeth, wind that howled through the pines, snow that lashed sideways, visibility shrinking to a narrow tunnel of white. The world turned into a place where direction was guessed and silence was weaponized. Inside the cabin, Ethan felt it before he saw it. Not the weather, the shift. The air had been heavy since the warehouse incident, since the muffled blast and the scrambling men, since Coda's instincts had dragged Ethan back from the edge of a quiet death, since Ethan had stood at his window afterward and realized that truth, once seen, became a kind of debt. Tonight, that debt came calling. Coda lay near the fire, leg wrapped, eyes half-lidded, but his ears never stopped moving. They twitched at every creak of the cabin boards, every gust that rattled the shutters. He was resting, but he wasn't at peace. Neither was Ethan. He hadn't told anyone what he saw at the warehouse, not yet. He'd planned to find Frost in the morning, to speak carefully, to keep it contained. But the town had a way of hearing things without being told. In North Haven, secrets traveled faster than plows. A dull engine sound rolled through the storm, low and persistent. Ethan froze. The sound wasn't coming from the forest wind. It had rhythm, intent. It grew louder, then softer, then louder again, like someone circling. Coda lifted his head immediately, amber eyes sharpening. His lips didn't curl, he didn't bark, but his whole body stiffened, and Ethan saw the line of his spine become a drawn bow. Headlights flashed through the trees, brief, pale beams slicing the snowfall. Then another set. 2 vehicles. Ethan's jaw tightened. He moved to the window but didn't pull the curtain back. He didn't need to. He'd learned long ago. If someone wanted you to know they were there, they'd announce it. If they didn't, they'd still be watching. The vehicles idled somewhere down the road, engines growling like bored predators. Then, silence. Ethan's stomach sank. Silence after engines meant one thing: men on foot. He turned, moving quickly but not frantically. He grabbed Koda's leash and clipped it on. Koda rose, limping but determined, as if pain was irrelevant when duty arrived. "Easy," Ethan murmured. Not because Koda was panicking, but because Ethan needed the reminder himself. He pulled on his coat, shouldered a small pack, and checked the back door. A gust shoved it inward the moment he cracked it open, flinging snow across the threshold. The storm wanted inside. Ethan guided Koda out into the dark. They didn't head toward the road. Ethan angled into the trees behind the cabin, using the forest the way he'd used it in other winters, other places, as cover, as root, as ally. Snow swallowed their footsteps quickly. The wind roared, but beneath it Ethan caught something else. Voices. Men's voices, close enough to carry. Koda's ears pinned forward. He pulled slightly, not toward the voices, but away, like he knew the safest path wasn't straight. Ethan trusted him. They moved through the pines, snow piling on Ethan's shoulders, melting down the collar of his shirt. His boots punched through drifts, each step a quiet fight. Koda stayed close, limping but relentless, breath coming faster now, steam curling from his muzzle. Ethan's lungs burned. The cold tasted like metal. The forest thinned as they reached the old service road that cut toward the river, a route Ethan remembered from childhood, when kids dared each other to cross the frozen bend and swear they'd seen lights out on the lake. Ahead, the wooden bridge emerged through the storm. It was old, planks darkened by decades of snow and thaw, rails warped and splintered. It crossed a river that ran sluggish beneath a skin of ice, the water black where it still moved, like an eye refusing to close. Ethan slowed. A bridge was a choke point, a trap if someone wanted it to be. Koda hesitated too, nostrils flaring. His injured leg trembled, but he didn't sit. He waited for Ethan's decision. Ethan stepped onto the first plank. It creaked beneath his weight. Then a voice cut through the storm, close, amused, sharp. "Well, well!" Headlights flared behind them, washing the bridge in harsh white. Ethan turned just enough to see silhouettes at the far end. 3 men, then 2 more stepping from the snow like they'd been grown there. And at the center of them, standing as if the storm belonged to him, Blake Hargreaves. He wasn't dressed for the cold the way Ethan was. Blake wore a dark, expensive coat that repelled snow, a scarf wrapped neatly at his throat, gloves that looked untouched by labor. His hair was slicked back despite the wind, stubbornly styled like vanity could defeat weather. The stubble along his jaw made him look dangerous in the way magazines sell danger. His eyes gleamed with satisfaction. Ethan's gaze flicked over the others. Men built for intimidation, not endurance. One carried a metal pipe, holding it like a trophy. Another had a hunting knife clipped to his belt, more decoration than plan. Koda growled, low, controlled, vibrating through the bridge boards. Blake spread his hands slightly, smiling as if welcoming a guest. "You've been snooping," he said, voice smooth and loud enough to carry over the wind. "That's not polite." Ethan kept his face calm, though every muscle in his body prepared. "I don't know what you're talking about," Ethan said. Blake laughed. "Sure, and I'm the Tooth Fairy." He stepped forward, boots thudding on the bridge planks. His men followed. Ethan's options narrowed. Behind him, open forest, but the storm made running blind. Ahead, Blake and 5 men. Blake stopped a few feet away, leaning in like he wanted to smell fear. "Here's the thing. He said quietly. People in this town survive by remembering who owns the ground beneath their feet. Ethan's voice stayed flat. You don't own anything. Blake's smile sharpened. I own enough. Then Blake's gaze slid to Coda, and his expression became ugly, an old cruelty resurfacing. That dog of yours, he said, keeps looking at me like he knows something. Coda's ears pinned back for a second, then lifted again, eyes steady. Blake nodded at the man with the pipe. Teach him some manners. The man stepped forward fast, raising the metal pipe. He didn't swing at Ethan. He swung at Coda. The pipe cut through the storm air and struck Coda's shoulder with a sickening clang. Coda yelped, one sharp, involuntary sound, and staggered. His injured leg buckled. For a heartbeat, the dog's proud body dipped toward the icy planks. Ethan felt something inside him go perfectly still. Not rage, clarity. The same clarity that used to come in, the seconds before breach, when noise disappeared, when the world narrowed to necessary action. Ethan moved. He closed the distance in 3 steps, faster than the men could process. He caught the attacker's wrist mid-swing, twisting just enough to break grip without breaking bone. The pipe clattered to the bridge and skidded across the planks. Ethan pivoted, using the man's momentum like a lever. A controlled sweep of the leg, a shoulder turn. The attacker hit the boards hard, wind knocked out of him in a woof. Another man rushed in, fists swinging wild. Ethan sidestepped, blocked, and landed a short strike to the shoulder, precise, not brutal. The man's arm went slack, and he crumpled, stunned more by shock than injury. A third came from the side. Ethan ducked under a clumsy punch, hooked the man's elbow, and drove him into the bridge rail with enough force to end the fight without ending the man. No wasted motion. No cruelty. Just efficiency. Blake stumbled, backward, eyes wide now, his arrogance cracking like ice under weight. Who the hell are you? He shouted over the wind, voice suddenly higher. Ethan didn't answer with a speech. He checked Coda first. He dropped to one knee, hand on Coda's chest, scanning for injury. Coda trembled, pain flashing in his eyes. But he stayed upright, leaning into Ethan like an oath. Ethan pressed his forehead to Coda's briefly, grounding himself. Then he stood. The remaining men hesitated. They had expected a frightened stranger. They had found something else. A man who moved like consequences. Blake's face twisted. You think you're tough? He spat. You think you're some kind of hero? Ethan's gray-blue eyes held him, calm, unreadable, cold as northern sky. This ends tonight, Ethan said softly. Blake scoffed, trying to inflate himself again. You can't do anything. You don't know who I am. Ethan took a slow step forward, then another. He stopped, within arm's reach, the storm swirling around them like an audience. I know exactly what you are, Ethan said. A man who hurts what can't fight back. Blake's lips curled. And what are you? Ethan's voice stayed level. A man who used to fight for a living. Blake's eyes widened again. Military? Ethan didn't correct him. He didn't boast. He let the truth hang in the air like ice. Blake swallowed, the first real fear sliding into his gaze. For the first time, he looked not at Ethan's clothes or silence, but at the way Ethan's body held itself. Balanced, ready, controlled. You're one of them, Blake whispered, as if the word tasted dangerous. SEAL. Ethan didn't confirm. He didn't need to. Blake's men shifted uneasily, glancing at each other. The idea of violence had been fun when it was safe. Now it wasn't safe. Blake's pride fought his fear. You won't touch me, he snapped, trying to regain ground. You touch me, and this town buries you. People disappear up here. Ethan's eyes didn't blink. "I'm not here to disappear." He gestured toward the men on the ground. "Pick them up. Get off this bridge." Blake stared at him, disbelief mixing with humiliation. "You're letting me walk away?" Ethan's voice was quiet, but it cut cleaner than wind. "I'm choosing not to become you." For a moment, the storm seemed to pause, as if the world itself wanted to hear that sentence. Blake's mouth opened, an insult ready, a threat rehearsed, but the words came out weaker than he intended. "This isn't over." Ethan turned away first, not because he feared Blake, because he refused to feed him. Ethan guided Coda toward the far end of the bridge, into the trees. Coda limped badly now, shoulder sore, leg aggravated, but he kept moving, head up, refusing collapse. Behind them, Blake shouted something crude, something about dogs and cowards and power, but it sounded hollow against the storm. Ethan didn't look back. He carried Coda the last stretch through deep snow, arms burning, breath ragged. The dog's body was heavy, warm, alive. That was all that mattered. Back at the cabin, Ethan laid Coda near the fire and checked him thoroughly. Shoulder bruised, leg swollen, but nothing broken beyond what already was. He wrapped the shoulder, reinforced the leg bandage, and sat on the floor with his back against the wall. Outside, the storm screamed. Inside, Ethan's hands trembled, not from cold, but from the aftershock of restraint. He had fought, he had won, and he had not crossed the line. Coda rested his head on Ethan's boot, eyes half closed. Ethan stared into the fire and felt something settle in his chest, like a vow. Blake now knew what Ethan was, and men like Blake didn't forgive exposure. But Ethan had learned something tonight, carved into the bones of the bridge. There was a kind of strength that didn't destroy. It stopped. When Ethan bent to lift Coda off the bridge, Coda suddenly turned his head and stared past Ethan, into the storm behind them. Not at Blake, beyond Blake. Coda's ears snapped forward and his growl deepened, not louder but lower, as if his body recognized a second danger layered beneath the first. Ethan followed the dog's gaze. For a brief second, through the whipping snow, he saw a dark figure standing off the road near the tree line, still as a post, watching, too far to identify, too calm to be one of Blake's clowns. Then the wind shifted, snow thickened, and the figure vanished as if the storm swallowed it whole. Ethan's spine chilled. Blake was a problem, but that watcher, silent, patient, unseen, felt like something else entirely. The storm didn't end in a dramatic moment. It didn't roar one last time and then collapse like a defeated beast. It simply tired. By morning, the wind had softened. Snow still fell, but gently now, as if the sky had run out of anger and decided to whisper instead. The world outside Ethan's cabin looked almost tender. Pines dusted in white, the river hidden beneath ice, the road smoothed over like a wound pretending it had healed. Inside, Ethan sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold. His hands were steady, but his mind wasn't. Coda lay near the fire, shoulder wrapped, leg bandaged, his breathing slow. His amber eyes watched Ethan whenever Ethan went still too long, like he didn't trust silence anymore, unless he could read Ethan's face. Ethan stared at the wall and listened to the cabin's creaks. He'd handled Blake. He'd handled men with pipes and cheap courage. What he didn't know how to handle was what came after. Because he'd seen the warehouse. He'd smelled the smoke. He'd watched panic spill out into snow. And now Blake had looked into Ethan's eyes and recognized something he couldn't bully. Blake wouldn't forget. And if Ethan stayed quiet, it wouldn't be peace. It would be surrender. Ethan rose, crossed to the footlocker he'd shoved under the bed. He pulled it out and opened it, expecting something that could fix this. There were no weapons inside, only reminders. A folded flag, worn gloves, a few dog tags that weren't his. A photograph he kept face down because looking at it felt like reopening a scar. Ethan closed the lid. He wasn't going back to war, but he was done pretending the war couldn't follow him home. He took Coda's leash and knelt beside the dog. "We're going into town," he said softly. Coda's ears lifted. He tried to stand too quickly and hissed a little through his teeth. If dogs could have teeth grimaces, Coda did. Ethan steadied him with a hand against his chest. "Easy," Ethan murmured. "We'll do it slow." They drove carefully, tires crunching through fresh snow. North Haven looked calmer than it had the night before, but calm wasn't the same as safe. The town had the stillness of a room after someone screams. Quiet, yes, but heavy with what had happened. Ethan stopped at the gas station first. Daniel Frost was outside near the office door, scraping ice from the edge of a window with a key. He looked like he hadn't slept. The lines on his weathered face seemed deeper, his mustache more unkempt, as if the storm had pulled the tiredness out of him and refused to give it back. His uniform jacket hung open, revealing a flannel shirt beneath. He was broad-shouldered, solid, the kind of man who had once been strong enough to feel invincible and had lived long enough to know better. He turned when he saw Ethan's truck. For a moment, Frost's eyes flicked to Coda, then to Ethan's face, and something in him shifted, like a man who had prayed for an answer and didn't know what to do when it arrived. Ethan stepped out, breath visible in the cold. "We need to talk," he said. Frost didn't pretend. He nodded once. Inside. The station office smelled of burnt coffee and old paper. Frost shut the door behind them, cutting off the town's quiet. Ethan didn't waste time. He laid out what he'd seen. The warehouse near the frozen lake, the generator lights, the propane cylinders, the tire tracks from heavy trucks, the muffled blast. He didn't embellish. He didn't dramatize. Truth was dramatic enough. Frost listened without interrupting, his jaw working slowly as if chewing something bitter. When Ethan finished, Frost exhaled through his nose. "I've suspected," he admitted, "for a long time." Ethan's eyes narrowed. "Then why didn't you stop it?" Frost's gaze dropped to his hands. Big hands, cracked at the knuckles, hands that had worn a badge so long it had become part of his skin. "Because suspicion isn't evidence," Frost said quietly, "and because this town depends on that mill." His voice tightened on the word depends, like he hated it. "You shut down Hargreaves, people lose jobs, families lose heat. They blame you. They blame anyone." Ethan's throat tightened. "So you let him hurt people?" Frost's eyes flashed. "No." He leaned forward slightly, his voice low. "I let myself believe the lesser evil was still an evil I could live with." He swallowed, the confession heavy. And then years pass, and you wake up one day and realize you've been paying in pieces of your own soul. Ethan sat back. He understood that kind of payment. Frost opened a drawer and pulled out a folder thick with papers, receipts, dates, copies of anonymous complaints, notes written in careful block letters like someone feared their handwriting could betray them. "I've been building this," Frost said, "but I'm not the one who can finish it." Ethan's gaze sharpened. "Who can?" Frost hesitated, then picked up a phone, old and scratched, and dialed a number from memory. He spoke quietly into the receiver. "It's Frost, North Haven. I've got what you asked for." Ethan watched him, surprised. Frost hung up and looked at Ethan with tired honesty. State and federal have been circling this for months. They needed something solid, something they could move on. He nodded toward Ethan's description. Warehouse and fuel violations. That's leverage. That's probable cause. Coda, lying near Ethan's boots, lifted his head as if he understood the tone of the room. Frost's gaze softened when he saw the dog. Your boy okay? Ethan's hand rested on Coda's neck. He will be. Frost nodded once, and for the first time Ethan saw something else in the older man's eyes. Relief mixed with shame. I should have done more. Sooner, Frost said. Ethan didn't let him drown in it. Do more now, Ethan replied. Frost's lips twitched faintly. Yeah, that's the plan. They left the office together. Outside, snow fell gently. The town moved around them like it was afraid to make noise. On the sidewalk across the street, Mary Collins stood outside her store, sweeping snow off the step with short, stubborn strokes. Her iron-gray bun was slightly loose, wisps of hair escaping like she'd been too busy to care. When she saw Ethan and Frost together, she paused, broom held mid-air. Mary's eyes met Ethan's. She didn't smile, but she nodded once, slow and firm, like an old witness signing her name to the truth. Ethan's chest tightened. A simple nod shouldn't feel like hope, but in a town like this, it did. They drove in a small convoy an hour later, Frost's cruiser ahead, Ethan's truck behind. Ethan wasn't invited to ride with the authorities. Frost didn't want to tie Ethan to the case officially yet. It was safer that way. Ethan understood. The Hargreaves mill sat on the edge of town, a hulking structure of steel and stacked timber, its yard filled with logs like bones piled high. The air around it smelled of sap and diesel and cold machinery. Smoke rose from a chimney, turning into a thin gray line against the winter sky. 2 unmarked vehicles were already parked near the entrance when they arrived. A woman stepped out of the first one, moving with controlled purpose. She was in her early 40s, average height, athletic build, her posture straight in a way that suggested discipline rather than vanity. Her hair was dark brown, pulled into a severe bun that didn't allow distraction. Her face was sharp, high cheekbones, calm eyes the color of riverstone. No visible makeup, no softness in the expression, but not cruelty either, just focus. The kind of woman who didn't raise her voice because she never needed to. She approached Frost and offered a gloved hand. Chief Frost, she said. Her voice was even, professional, carrying a faint Midwestern edge. Frost shook her hand. Agent Kincaid. Kincaid's gaze flicked briefly to Ethan, then to Coda. She didn't smile at the dog, but her eyes softened a fraction, like she respected loyalty when she saw it. You were right, Frost said quietly. It's worse than we thought. Kincaid nodded. That's usually how it is. Then to Ethan, you're Ethan Cole. Ethan didn't flinch. Yes. Kincaid studied him briefly, taking in the military posture, the steady eyes, the quiet restraint. We're not here for you, she said, but your timing's inconvenient for certain people. Ethan's voice stayed calm. Good. A faint flicker crossed Kincaid's face, almost a smile quickly buried. She gestured toward the mill. We have warrants. Safety inspection violations, fire code, fuel storage. If someone's running, anything illegal on the side, we'll find it. Ethan felt his heart beat once, hard, then settle. This wasn't vengeance. This was procedure. And procedure, when it finally showed up, was a kind of justice, too. Kincaid nodded toward the yard. Stay back. Let us work. Ethan remained near his truck with Coda at his side, leash in hand. Coda stood tall, coat shining against the snow, ears forward, eyes tracking movement with quiet authority. Despite his injury, he held himself like a guardian who refused to leave his post. Workers at the mill paused, pretending to keep busy while watching from the corners of their eyes. A few faces were familiar, the kind of men who'd laughed too loudly in town, too comfortable in Blake's shadow. Then the mill office door opened. Blake Hargreaves stepped out, and even from across the yard, Ethan could see the difference. Blake's swagger was there at first, coat buttoned perfectly, scarf neatly arranged, hair styled even in winter. But his face was paler, and his eyes moved too quickly, calculating exits. He spotted the unmarked vehicles. He spotted Frost. Then, his gaze locked onto Ethan. Shock flashed across Blake's face, followed by fury so sharp it almost looked like fear in disguise. Blake strode forward, but Kincaid met him halfway. "Blake Hargreaves?" she asked. Blake forced a smile. "That's me. What's this about?" Kincaid didn't answer with a story. She answered with papers. She held up the warrant like a mirror. "We're conducting an inspection and executing a warrant," she said. "Step aside." Blake's jaw clenched. "You can't just—" Kincaid's voice remained calm. "Try me." Blake's eyes darted again, searching for allies in the yard. He found none. Workers looked away. A man who might have once defended him suddenly found great interest in a pile of lumber. Blake's throat bobbed as he swallowed. Kincaid stepped closer. "Mr. Hargreaves, you're being detained pending investigation into multiple violations and charges." The words landed like a hammer in snow, soundless but final. Blake's expression cracked. "This is insane," he hissed, voice shaking. "You know who I am?" Kincaid's tone didn't change. "Yes," she said. "And today it doesn't matter." Handcuffs clicked, metal on wrists, a sound so small, and yet the entire town seemed to hear it. Blake's face twisted, searching for Ethan, searching for the satisfaction of being hated, because hatred would mean he still mattered. Ethan didn't give him that. Ethan's hand rested on Coda's neck, fingers sunk into warm fur, grounding himself. Coda, who had been a statue through it all, gave a slow wag of his tail. Not excited, not triumphant, just relieved. The mill yard was silent. No cheering, no clapping, just the quiet exhale of people who had been holding their breath for years. Snow fell softly, like mercy. Blake was guided toward the unmarked vehicle, his boots slipping once on the ice, dignity unraveling with each step. For a second, he looked smaller, less like a king, more like a boy who'd finally been told no by someone the world actually listened to. As the car door closed, Ethan saw Mary Collins across the street, standing still with her broom in hand, eyes shining. Frost stood beside Ethan, his shoulders sagging slightly, as if he'd been carrying a weight for decades and had finally set it down. Kincaid walked back toward Frost, her expression unreadable. "This is just the start," she said quietly, "but it's enough to move." Frost nodded, swallowing hard. "Thank you." Kincaid's gaze flicked to Ethan once more. "You did the right thing," she said, then turned away. Ethan watched the unmarked vehicle pull out of the yard, tires crunching over snow. He didn't feel victory. He felt something else. A strange, quiet grief for the years the town had lost, for the damage fear had done, for the fact that justice often arrived late. Coda leaned into Ethan's leg. Ethan looked down at him. "Yeah," Ethan whispered, voice tight. "Me too." And as the snow continued to fall like a soft blessing, the town of North Haven stood still, learning how to breathe again. As Ethan turned to leave the mill yard, Coda suddenly stopped walking. He planted his paws in the snow and stared toward the far end of the lumber stacks, ears forward, eyes narrowed. Ethan followed the dog's gaze. Between two towering piles of logs, something glinted briefly, like a small light catching on metal. A phone camera lens. Someone was filming. Before Ethan could step closer, the glint vanished. A shadow slipped behind the stacks and disappeared into the maze of timber. Coda growled low. Ethan's stomach tightened. Blake was in cuffs, but someone else, someone quieter, was still watching. Spring arrived without asking permission. It didn't come all at once, and it didn't announce itself the way winters did in North Haven. There were no storms, no warnings, just small signs. Snow retreating from the shaded edges of the road, water dripping steadily from rooftops, the quiet reappearance of color where only white had lived for months. Ethan noticed it first in the sound. The town no longer creaked under ice. It breathed. He stood on the porch of the cabin one morning with a mug of coffee warming his hands, watching sunlight stretch across the clearing like a gentle hand testing the world. The air smelled different now. Less metal, more earth. Damp soil, pine sap, the faint sweetness of something trying to grow again. Behind him, Coda lay stretched out on the wooden boards, soaking up the sun like it was a gift personally addressed to him. The German shepherd looked older in the light. Not weaker, just wiser. His black and tan coat had regained its shine, though the white at the edges of his muzzle was more visible now. His injured leg still stiffened in the mornings, and he rose slowly, carefully, like a veteran of his own silent battles. But his eyes were bright again, calm, at peace. Ethan took a sip of coffee and felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Stillness without tension. For weeks after Blake's arrest, Ethan had expected something else to happen. Retaliation. Threats. The town turning on him for bringing attention it didn't want. None of it came. Instead, things simply shifted. People began holding doors open again. The bar stayed open later. Children rode their bikes past sunset without being called back inside. Conversations lingered in the street, instead of breaking apart the moment someone unfamiliar walked by. Fear didn't vanish, but it loosened its grip. Ethan noticed it in small moments. Mary Collins started leaving her store door unlocked in the afternoons. Daniel Frost stopped looking, like a man preparing for retirement, and started looking like a man planning a future. Even Lena at the cafe smiled more easily now, her shoulders less tight, her voice warmer when she asked, "The usual?" And then one afternoon, something happened that finally answered the question Ethan hadn't been brave enough to ask himself. A woman knocked on his door. She was in her late 30s, maybe early 40s, with tired brown eyes and hands that shook slightly as she held the leash of a young golden retriever. The dog was beautiful, thick coat, floppy ears, but terrified. He pressed against her legs like he wanted to crawl back inside her shadow. "My name is Rachel," the woman said softly. "Someone told me you might help." Rachel was average height, with dark hair pulled into a messy ponytail, strands falling loose around a face that had learned how to worry professionally. Her jacket was clean but worn, the kind of coat someone keeps for years because they don't replace things unless they absolutely have to. She swallowed. "My son. He was in the accident last year. And this dog, he hasn't been the same since. He won't go near strangers. He barks at everything. He won't sleep." Ethan looked at the dog, then at Coda, who had risen slowly and was standing beside Ethan's leg, posture relaxed, tail low, eyes gentle. Coda stepped forward, not fast, not threatening. He sat down 3 feet away from the retriever and simply waited. The retriever froze. Then, very slowly, he leaned forward and sniffed Koda's muzzle. Koda didn't move, didn't blink, didn't assert anything. He just existed. The retriever let out a small, uncertain whine and sat down. Rachel covered her mouth with her hand. Ethan felt something settle inside his chest. Not pride, recognition. "Come in," Ethan said. That was how it began. Not with a plan, not with a business idea. Just with one woman, one frightened dog, and a quiet moment that felt like permission. Within a month, there were 3 more. A teenage boy with a rescued husky that snapped when touched. An elderly man with a trembling beagle who howled every night since his wife died. A little girl who hadn't spoken since her parents' divorce, but held tightly to a small mixed-breed mutt like it was the last stable thing in her world. They all came to Ethan, and all of them responded first to Koda. Ethan never advertised. He never put up a sign. But in a town that had learned to whisper instead of speak, word traveled anyway. Ethan cleared out the old tool shed behind the cabin and turned it into something simple. A warm room with mats on the floor, low benches, soft light. He didn't call it a training center. He just called it the space. People brought their dogs. Ethan taught them patience, not commands, not tricks. Patience. He showed them how to breathe slowly, how to let dogs come to them instead of forcing, connection, how to sit quietly, how to listen with their bodies. And Koda became something else entirely. Not a working dog, not a soldier, a presence. Children lay beside him while he rested, their small hands buried in his fur. Adults spoke near him more softly, as if his calm demanded it. Dogs with fear issues approached him like he carried answers in his scent. He didn't fix anyone. He simply made them feel safe long enough to try. Ethan watched it all from the edge, hands in his pockets, heart doing something unfamiliar. Healing. Not dramatic, not loud, just steady. One afternoon, Lena came by with a box of coffee cups and pastries. She stood on the porch, sunlight catching in her auburn hair, freckles bright against skin no longer as tired as it used to be. "You look busy," she said, smiling. Ethan shrugged. "Didn't plan it." Lena glanced inside the space, at a young boy sitting on the floor with Koda, reading aloud while Koda lay with his head in the boy's lap. Lena's eyes softened. "None of the good things ever are," she said. They sat on the porch together, sharing coffee, watching spring push itself into the world inch by inch. Lena spoke about her sister, who was thinking of moving back to town, about how the cafe felt lighter now, about how she didn't lock the back door anymore. Ethan listened, and for the first time since he'd returned, he realized he wasn't waiting to leave. He was staying, not because he was trapped, but because he was chosen. That evening, Ethan found Koda standing alone at the edge of the clearing, staring toward the forest. Not alert, not tense, just reflective. Ethan walked over. "What is it, old man?" Koda didn't move. He simply lifted his head slightly, letting the warm breeze run through his fur. Then he sat and waited. Ethan sat beside him. They didn't speak. They didn't move. And in that silence, Ethan felt something strange and beautiful. For the first time in years, neither of them was listening for danger. They were listening for life. Spring deepened. Flowers pushed through soil that had been frozen solid for months. The river broke free from its icy prison and began to sing again, loud and unashamed. The air smelled like beginnings. Ethan repaired the roof instead of patching it. He painted the porch instead of just replacing the boards. He planted a small garden behind the cabin. Nothing ambitious, just tomatoes, herbs, things that needed daily care and offered quiet rewards. Coda supervised everything, always nearby, always watching, not guarding, belonging. Rachel came back one afternoon with her son. The boy stood a little straighter now. He smiled when he saw Coda. The golden retriever followed him calmly, no longer trembling. "He sleeps through the night now," Rachel said, eyes wet. "So do I." Ethan nodded, not trusting himself to speak. Later that week, Daniel Frost stopped by. He was out of uniform, wearing a simple jacket, his mustache trimmed for once. He looked lighter. "Retiring in June," Frost said, leaning against the porch rail. "Not running anymore." Ethan smiled faintly. "What will you do?" Frost shrugged. "Fish. Maybe teach. Remind myself who I am without a badge." They stood in silence for a moment. "You did enough," Frost said quietly. Ethan shook his head. "I just stayed." Frost smiled. "Sometimes that's the bravest part." As the sun dipped behind the trees, casting long shadows across the yard, Ethan sat on the porch with Coda lying beside him, warm and heavy, breathing slow and steady. The town felt different now. Not perfect, not healed, but honest. Ethan thought about the man he had been when he returned, closed off, carrying too much weight, convinced peace meant isolation. He thought about the choices he'd made since. Not the fights, not the confrontations, the moments he had chosen to listen, to stay, to let a dog teach him how to trust again. Ethan rested his hand on Coda's back. The dog leaned into it, content. "I think we're okay," Ethan murmured. Coda's tail thumped once in agreement, and as the evening breeze carried the scent of pine and new grass across the porch, Ethan finally understood what the war had never taught him. Home wasn't a place you returned to. It was a place that welcomed you back when you were ready to become someone new. Sometimes we wait for miracles to arrive with thunder and light. We imagine that if God wants to change our lives, He will do it in ways that are loud, dramatic, impossible to ignore. But this story reminds us of a different kind of miracle, a quiet one. Ethan did not defeat evil with revenge. Coda did not save anyone with teeth or violence. The town was not healed by anger or by power or by destruction. They were healed by something much harder: restraint, courage, and love. God did not send a miracle from the sky. He sent a wounded man who chose not to become bitter. He sent a loyal dog who trusted when it would have been easier to fear. He sent a series of small choices that, together, changed an entire community. And that is how God often works in our lives. Not through instant answers, but through quiet strength. Not through perfect circumstances, but through faithful hearts. In our daily lives, we face moments just like Ethan's. Moments where staying silent feels safer than speaking truth. Moments where walking away feels easier than standing firm. Moments where anger feels justified, but love feels impossible. This story reminds us that real power is not found in hurting others. It is found in protecting what is good, in choosing patience over revenge, in choosing faith over fear. Because when we do what is right, even when no one is watching, God is already working behind the scenes. The greatest miracles are not always the ones that change the world around us. They are the ones that change the world inside us. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment and tell us what this story reminded you of. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more stories of faith, courage, and healing. May God bless you, protect you, and guide your steps. May He remind you that even in your quiet struggles, you are not alone. And may you discover, just like Ethan and Coda, that sometimes the miracle is not escaping the storm, but becoming strong enough to walk through it with faith.